Hi everyone, happy Wellness Wednesday right in front of my Christmas tree. I wanted to welcome Dr. Keith Berkowitz with us again. We're going to talk about anxiety. And if you don't know by now, anxiety is one of the most, about 40 million adults in the United States suffer from anxiety, and only 36% of them get actually treated. So there's a huge gap and a huge amount of people in the population that are left out. And what Dr. Berkowitz and I are here to discuss with you today is, what is anxiety? Do you have anxiety, and what can you do about it? So we're going to really get into it. We talked about it last week. Unfortunately, it didn't get recorded. Recap everything we discussed and talk about some tips and tricks for you to use. So we're just getting Keith connected. Hi, Keith.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. Just had some anxiety.
From trying to get in?
No, I was shaving and the blade kind of
Oh
off.
no!
So I'm wounded today.
You're wounded today. Okay, well, we're sending you lots of healing from Los Angeles. Just take some extra vitamin C, you'll be fine.
Gotcha. Done.
It's good for wound healing. So I've decided to change the background today and sit in front of my Christmas tree because it makes me happy and it makes me feel calm.
You know what's so interesting about that? So you're in LA and we're about to get our first snowstorm of the year. So we're about to get maybe up to a foot of snow today in New York.
Wow. Okay. Which is I kind of like that. I like the change of seasons. I miss that living in London.
So I should have a snow background. I'm going to find one for next time with all the snow and stuff so that we're really appropriate for the weather.
I love it. I love it. Okay, Keith, today we are talking about anxiety. And we talked about it last week. And, for those listening, I was just telling everybody that, 1 in 5 people in the United States suffer from anxiety. And not very many people are actually treated. It's the most common of the mental illnesses in the US and globally. The World Health Organization says there's about 300 million people who have anxiety disorder. That's huge. And so what I want to discuss with all of you today that are listening is, if you have anxiety or if you even have bouts of anxiety, even though you don't have it all the time, there are things you can do to support your levels of anxiety and support your overall health and wellness. And Dr. Keith and I are here to talk about it. And if you have any questions along the way, please send your questions to us and we will be sure to answer them.
Since last week, I was kind of thinking about this, and I was thinking about, two different types, right? People think of acute anxiety, that acute episode. But I think what people often kind of downplay is the chronic anxiety. And I think that's really felt dramatically during this pandemic. The day in, day out, low-level anxiety that wears our body down. And, affects our cortisol, affects our sleep, increases our caffeine, alcohol.
Yes.
Also.
Yes. And you talked about the pandemic diet, right? Coffee in the morning and alcohol in the evening. So, it's one of those things now that we've been struck with this crisis, this global health crisis, the COVID-19. It is literally, I'm sure that we have come up in terms of anxiety. Whoever had low-grade anxiety is now stepped on the gas now. It's like way out there. Everybody I know, everybody I talk to, Keith, healthcare practitioners, friends of mine, family, every single person I know is stressed out, except for the 4-legged creatures, of course. They're happy as can be because they have us home.
Well, you know what? They make their own vitamin C, so their cortisol levels are much better maintained than ours. So it's a little unfair if you think about it.
It's really unfair that they make their own vitamin C. We don't make our own vitamin C. Guinea pigs don't make their own vitamin C. And bats don't make their own vitamin C.
So there's your anxious groups right there. That's the high anxiety groups right there.
Guinea pigs, humans, and bats. Okay. Got it. Did everybody get that? Okay. So tell us, Keith, in terms of, the fight or flight response, I want to basically explain, and you do this so well, to everybody what that fight or flight response is, that anxiety trigger that we get when we're stressed out. It could be even a small thing like you cutting yourself. Let's talk about that.
Or you've been going shopping this morning with my 18-year-old daughter.
Oh gosh, Keith, I've gone shopping with you before. Oh no!
That's anxiety.
That's anxiety provoking for sure.
Visa is the only one that's happy about that.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is the fight or flight response. It's really our body's response to stress. Stress could be as simple as a phone call, the doorbell ringing, credit card bill, opening the mail. And what happens is our body's abnormal response to that, where our heart rate raises, our blood pressure can rise, and we get sweaty, or we, feel chilly. People can get sometimes chest pain, shortness of breath, and then we get this what we call adrenaline response. That thing we talked about always again and again, cortisol, that large cortisol secretion causing us to really feel bad. What's interesting about it, it's not the anxiety itself that causes the symptoms, but it's the adrenaline or cortisol, what we call neurotransmitter response to that, which causes our symptoms. And I think that's what really becomes problematic. And again, we talked about in the past that often, I use New York as an example, we can go through 70, 80 episodes a day of that. So can you imagine 70, 80 episodes of this neurotransmitter surge that we're going through every day? That's got to wreak havoc on our bodies on a day in, day out basis.
And it reduces blood flow to the brain, right? So you have a dehydrated brain. So you're working with somebody, if you're having anxiety responses, your chances of you being dehydrated are really high. And it just goes on and on. Talk about the neurotransmitters, Keith, that we have. So we have, serotonin, we have thyroid hormones, GABA, epinephrine, norepinephrine, we have the endorphins and dopamine. Let's talk about those neurotransmitters. And what are neurotransmitters for those listening?
I almost think a neurotransmitter is kind of the messenger, right? So it's the body's messengers saying, okay, neuron, you got to do something, or cell, you have to do something. Yes. It's the body's, telephone call in a sense to, or to give instructions. So they're really needed for instructions. The problem is you don't want too many instructions because you get confused, or you don't want too little instructions, you don't get anything done, right? I think I always kind of look at that as a good way to see. And again, also you want them in balance. Like we think of the more stimulating neurotransmitters like epinephrine or norepinephrine.
Yeah.
Well, you don't want that constantly being going, right? Then your body's always under stress. I love the analogy of it's like driving a car and your foot's on the gas all the time. That's great if you have a highway in front of you, but if you're trying to park, not so good. No. You hit the garage.
Right.
And so that's important. And the way to balance that is the other ones we talk about, which you said before, the happy hormones or happy neurotransmitters like GABA, feel good. I love that. Great. With GABA or serotonin, but also dopamine's kind of interesting. Dopamine kind of plays a role in both. Dopamine both is kind of a stimulatory, but it's also our one that's needed for concentration. It's so interesting. We look at things like attention deficit disorder. Most of the drugs that are used for that, they work on the dopamine pathway. So in order for us to focus or concentrate, we need enough dopamine around.
Right. And exactly. And what we're going to talk about is how we can work with these symphony of neurotransmitters and how they do work. They're all connected and they affect us in terms of our mood, our appetite, the foods we choose, the life partners we choose. They're really, really important. So it's, let's start with serotonin, the feel-good neurotransmitter. We know that low levels of serotonin can lead to anxiety and depression. And anxiety quite often, reduces if you have chronic bouts of anxiety. If you're having these 70 hits of fight or flight responses a day, chances are that you're depleting those serotonin levels. Keith, how does this actually happen?
So it's, the other thing we talked about before is like PMDD, like, premenstrual disorder. One of the characteristics is low serotonin. I think it's almost a usage aspect, right? So we think about, we have 1,000 units of serotonin we start out with day one. Every day we use it, and if we're not repleting it, that kind of goes away. And the key to serotonin, and we've talked about in this past, is digestive tract. Most of these neurotransmitters are made in your digestive system. So if your body's not repleting them, they're going to disappear. They're not going to be there. And we're not going to have them available for when we need them. Especially, we talked about before, mood regulation and preventing anxiety, preventing depression. That's so critical. And again, if you don't have them, you can't use them.
And it's so interesting you said that, because whenever I do an intake with a patient, in the last 20 years of me being a naturopathic doctor, what I've noticed is that every single patient that reports that they have digestive disturbances also has some form of anxiety and depression. Now, most of your neurotransmitters are made in your gut. So therefore, if you are having digestive issues, chances are you're going to have anxiety issues. So what do you treat first? Who has the answer to that? The gut.
Is that for me? Is that rhetorical to me or for you?
That's for all of us. So it's just to remind ourselves that when you optimize digestion, you optimize your feel-good hormones like serotonin. So that's your natural anti-anxiolytic and antidepressant. That is like fixing your gut first and foremost.
You know what's so interesting? If you actually look at some of the science now, they're actually even developing probiotics, specific strains for mood regulation. Yeah. It's really interesting. We're now seeing actually, and that's probably the future we're going to see, are these different types of probiotics and different strains based on actually the disorder we're dealing with. And I've already seen a couple look at anxiety or depression as a type of probiotic strain. It's kind of fascinating.
It's the lactobacillus and bifidobacterium that I've also looked at a lot of research. And that's why, one of the reasons why I created the probiotics was to help my patients with mood and food, because it helps with cravings as well. When you're on a probiotic, it's going to help you crave less sugar. And so, it's going to keep the bad bacteria out and the candida out, which then crave that sugar. So a lot of the reason why I had a patient once say to me, Dr. Nigma, it's not me craving the sugar, it's my bacteria and my candida and my gut. So it's like,
So my answer to that was let them feel the anxiety, not me.
Exactly. So, okay, we go on to now thyroid hormones. Thyroid hormones are huge in terms of anxiety and depression. And a large majority of the population, women in their 30s and 40s are being missed with subclinical hypothyroid issues. Talk to us about thyroid hormones and their role with anxiety.
So thyroid's really interesting. Again, we always refer to it as the mother hormone. Yeah. And I want to bring up one of the reasons it's missed is what's interesting. If you look at the lab values, we talked about this before, the labs have not readjusted their guidelines.
The reference ranges, yeah.
Right, yeah. So they still use up to 4.5 or 5 when you read that oftentimes 3 should really be the cutoff point for
I've read
underactive
2,
thyroid.
I read like 2.5 is about the cutoff point.
Right, in pregnancy or people in their fertile years, women should be actually even a tighter range, which, as you said. So thyroid's really interesting. So thyroid allows our body to deal with stress. What people don't realize is thyroid's also one of the other hormones that actually helps make cortisol. So you actually need thyroid hormone to make cortisol. Without that, and also what's interesting, and we find, is also the other aspect is thyroid helps us regulate blood sugar. And low blood sugar is another driver of this adrenaline response or fight or flight response that we see. So not having thyroid around really is a setup for anxiety and depression. And actually, if you read the guidelines for screening for depression and anxiety, one of the first tests you actually have to do is actually measure thyroid hormone or TSH.
So we're measuring TSH and free T3 and T4. And you and I always also do the TPOs and thyroglobulin antibodies because those are really important. We're seeing a huge surge in antibodies to the thyroid. Keith, where's that coming from?
So, what's interesting with COVID, and that's what's really interesting. So there's really a lot of good studies looking at COVID, that the stress of the infection itself is driving autoimmune disease. And there was an article recently, they talked about Epstein-Barr, which, we think of in Epstein-Barr virus, an infectious mononucleosis, but also really linked to chronic fatigue, where you're seeing where people may have been compensated and their thyroid may be okay, but the added stress of this infection and even the post-infection or the post-inflammatory response creates inflammation. Guess what? Autoimmune thyroid is. It's another form of inflammation. And people forget that the most common cause of underactive thyroid by a large amount is actually Hashimoto's thyroiditis or autoimmune thyroid.
And it's interesting when I do a case taking with my patient and I look at their history and I look at when the autoimmune condition could have started, it's usually never well since a virus. So there's a lot of viral a lot of viral etiology and origin to a lot of these autoimmune conditions. I mean, there's COVID-19 is one of the viruses, but there are so many other out there that we don't know about. Some of them we don't know about. Some of them we do know. We know about Epstein-Barr, which people suffer from lifelong if they don't get it under control. And in the same way, you're saying COVID-19 is triggering, an autoimmune response, particularly the thyroid, because it's a very sensitive gland. It's a very delicate gland.
And it's the most common autoimmune disorder that we have in the United States, so by far.
Right. Okay, so we looked at thyroid hormones, TSH, T3, and T4, and then GABA. I love GABA.
Because GABA helps you feel good. That's why.
Yes.
But also GABA is really important. GABA also helps make serotonin. So you know what's interesting about all these hormones and neurotransmitters is they're linked to each other, right? You need one to sometimes make another. So GABA has its role on its own in helping the brain, kind of feel good, but also in helping more serotonin be available as well.
All right. Let's talk about epinephrine and norepinephrine and anxiety.
So everyone knows about epinephrine from an EpiPen, right? Yeah. Right, from an allergy pen. So what does an EpiPen do? It allows our body to overcome stress, right? The stress of an allergic attack. So epinephrine and norepinephrine are our stress hormones that allow us to overcome when our body feels kind of depleted, whether it's low blood sugar, for example, whether it's an infection and our body has to work harder, or whether low blood pressure. It's a medicine often given in the hospital when people come in with low blood pressure and can't maintain their blood pressure at home. So that's are really stimulatory. So it's great to have epinephrine, norepinephrine in the daytime. Nighttime, not so good. No. Sleep will be very complicated in that aspect. But again, that's another thing that can actually get depleted over time as our body requires more and more.
Right.
To function.
And people that are taking benzodiazepines, what happens with this medication? Doesn't it bind with the GABA receptors?
Yes, and actually that's one of the reasons it's really interesting why they find a lot of these medications are very addictive and become very physically tolerant, because it uses up some of those neurotransmitters that our body would use elsewhere. And our body can't necessarily, once that medication stops, really recover immediately to make enough of that neurotransmitter to compensate.
That's why it's super important, if you're on medication, speak to your practitioner. Don't come off medication on your own. You have to wean off, and you have to be speaking to your practitioner.
I have a good analogy on the medications. This is my favorite analogy about that. Okay. Is think of the medications you have in a party, right?
Okay.
The medications prevent the neurotransmitters from leaving the party. So we have to find ways together to bring more neurotransmitters to the party. And that's often sometimes some of these natural treatments that look at, making more available by making a digestion better, or we'll talk about folic acid, other things that help do that.
Awesome. That is a good analogy. I love that. All right. And we talked about endorphins, and, they don't seem to be related to the creation of the anxiety, but how do they relate to anxiety and relieve anxiety?
So it's so interesting is how a stimulating process can actually make anxiety better, right? It's kind of counterintuitive. So that's where exercise really comes in. So, in COVID, actually, I've changed my exercise routine. I've gone to, I like the high intensity impact. It's shorter time. And I actually try to find a trainer my age, so it's more appropriate.
I know, right? It's hard to find a trainer my age.
I found a 51-year-old male that does a very good HIIT workout.
Okay.
I'm sold. And it could be 10 or 20 minutes. It all takes us a very short period of time through exercise. And it seems like intense exercise does this better to increase endorphins. What endorphins do, even though they're stimulatory, they really play a large role in mood stimulation, making mood better. I almost call them like a distractant, right? If you're not feeling good about something, you start exercising, your mind actually goes in a different direction, and you're focusing on something new and different.
That's a good way of putting it. And I think that's something for all of us. I mean, sitting in front of a computer all day, we're all doing Zooms and, telemedicine, and I'm guilty of it as well. I know that when I exercise, it does give me that endorphin release, and I feel better. It's like I've taken some kind of feel good something. And
so I call, I do, Nigma, I call that my telemedicine video for health. So I'm doing my telemedicine, psychiatric session in a sense with,
Yeah.
with the guy I'm using. His name is Funky Roberts. So with Funky Roberts and I are having a one-on-one session with exercise, which is actually, I walk away, my mood's better and I can focus again, and I feel better about everything I'm doing.
Now, Keith, are certain people more prone, and we look at anxiety as like a blanket term. When people are listening today, are certain personality types more prone to having anxiety? Being female, for example.
So being introverted, which
yes,
I told you I am, and
yes,
you don't believe me, but it's true.
I know.
And I think what it is it's certain groups. I mean, I think a female, and maybe some of that's also tied to hormones, right? We think about
100%.
Right, that underactive thyroid or sex hormone depletion is much more common in women, and you'll see that affect mood in a large way, and especially anxiety and sleep. So also, introverted people with family history, if their brothers and sisters or parents have anxiety, is more common, both from, an upbringing standpoint, the way we're taught, but also from a genetic standpoint, right? We talked about two genes that we talk a lot about that have a big role, which is MTHFR, which affects folic acid metabolism, and COMT, which affects estrogen metabolism and the body's ability to regulate neurotransmitters. Both of them are very common in anxiety disorders.
Let's talk about the MTHFR for a second. So people who are just taking regular folic acid out there and in their supplement form, how does that affect the MTHFR, in terms of being able to methylate that?
It's really interesting. If you turn on the internet and put in the term methylation, there's so much stuff. You have to methylate everything. So methylation, what it really means is taking that folic acid and turning it into a form that the body can utilize. And it's actually the methylated folic acid or methylfolate that is actually your precursor to your neurotransmitters. So we talked about that party example. So methylfolate is one of those party planners, right? We call it a party planner. So it's a party planner that's going to bring their friends to the party. Their friends being dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, serotonin, all come from methylfolate.
Yes. That's a brilliant way of putting it. They're going to bring them all to the party, and there's going to be a nice, diverse group of people interacting and feeling good. All right. I love it. Okay. So anyone out there, I think it's about 60% of the population has this, up to 60% we're seeing now.
Right. The groups that seem to be most affected, we see Eastern Europeans. It's a large Mediterranean populations. And again, what I do, I normally screen all my patients for it now at this age. Yeah, because again, it's so common today, and it may be upwards of 25% have both copies of the gene. People can have, the way genes work, you can have one copy, which one parent gave it to you, or two copies, which two parents. So one copy we call heterozygous, and two copies will go homogeneous. So homogeneous is the more severe form, the more problem form, where you have to really be more aggressive in treating. And that's because both parents have had that underlying genetic issue.
So people with the homozygous gene carrying two copies of that gene, you have to be more regimented in making sure that you're taking, a methylated folate. Usually it's termed 5-MTHFR. 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate, and a lot of these people, a lot of you guys can't metabolize. So taking folic acid is not going to help you. You have to take the methylated version. And then we have the COMT gene, which is really key. We have, again, one pair and two pairs. And Keith, how is that? I know that particular gene is increased susceptibility to bipolar depression, ADHD, alcoholism. Again, what can people do if they have copies of that particular gene?
So that's more challenging. What's interesting about that, they tend to go together, interesting enough, that you tend to see both together. I almost call the COMT as the detox gene, right? The inability to detox. So you can't get rid of, you have all these neurotransmitter debris you can't get rid of. So what you want to really do is work on getting the liver to function better. So liver.
Those are the really drunk people at the party that just won't leave.
Drunk and loud.
Yes. Yes.
I like that. That's a great analogy. So it's all about parties today because we are actually headed into the holidays.
We are. And
what it's interesting is things to help the liver work better, like milk thistle we often use, or N-acetylcysteine is really critical. They help the liver really detoxify and get rid of these excess neurotransmitters that the body doesn't want. Because remember, the body's trying to find balance. And when it's off balance, that's when anxiety, depression can be most problematic.
Absolutely. And we have a question here. How common is low testosterone in women, and how does that affect anxiety?
So I had a case yesterday. So a young woman, about 47 years old, her testosterone level was a high 0. Absolutely 0. So what's interesting is why, right? And we think about why. Well, I always think of testosterone as a resource allocation issue, where the body has so many resources, and if it doesn't have enough, your sex hormones, unfortunately, get kind of pushed aside. It's almost like I like the generator, right? You lose your power. You have a generator. You can only put light
use it for so long.
Right. So sex hormones are not in the category, and that's really common. And actually, fatigue, sex drive, mood is really affected by low testosterone. The other reason that often happens is we see that sometimes in thyroid disease, right? People with underactive thyroid will also can have a low testosterone as well. And the case I saw yesterday, which was interesting, is when actually her thyroid started getting better and her digestion, which also is affected, her testosterone naturally came up on its own.
Over 50% of my patients between the age of 45 and 55 have low testosterone levels. It's unbelievable. And we have to look at why that actually happens. And again, we talked about, how if you're running your adrenals at the speed of light, you're going to burn out that hormone. And let's talk about DHEA and testosterone, if we could add that in just for now.
That's a great point. So when you start talking about is cortisol and DHEA, I almost call them as like they're twins that don't get along, right?
Yes.
So what happens is either the body's going to put resources through DHEA, and remember DHEA is your precursor for estrogen, most of your estrogen and testosterone production. You do get some production from progesterone as well.
Sorry, I just
you went to find some DHEA.
I went
right?
I went to go find my DHEA. Sorry, I was just looking for the dog.
So what happens though is if you're making excess cortisol, you have less DHEA available, and that's one of the issues. So you cannot make as much estrogen and progesterone.
Okay, so what that means is if you're going through these fight or flight, stress and anxiety responses ongoing, what you're doing, think of this as fuel in your body. Like think of your body as a car. If you're burning the fuel out and you're driving around everywhere at the speed of light, think of your body as overreacting to things that are otherwise would be normal in a stressful in an environment. Then you're burning through that mother hormone, that DHEA, and that is your cortisol levels go up because you're stressed, and then boom, it burns out the DHEA, which then lowers the testosterone.
Right, and also as we age, DHEA also falls, right? That's one of the hormones that goes down as we
age.
And often is called the aging hormone for that reason.
It's really interesting, and women my age in their late 40s, we have a hard time building muscle mass when it comes to exercise. So we kind of lose hope in trying to exercise because we just don't see our muscles because we don't have that testosterone to build the muscle mass.
And it's so interesting that testosterone's always been really this male hormone, but what people don't realize, it's so critical for women. And when I see overwhelming fatigue, low sex drive, that is vaginal dryness. That's really a real key to look at testosterone levels, really important. And it's often left out because we don't supplement them typically. We only really replete estrogen and progesterone.
And in that saying that, B vitamins, B complex vitamins can really help improve, your hormone metabolism. And I want to just jump in here and talk about B vitamins for a minute. Can we talk about some of the B vitamins and how they can help with estrogen metabolism, testosterone, progesterone, and hormones in general?
I mean, it's so interesting. I mean, we talked about B5 and B6, which are really really important precursors, right? So we can make our hormones in the first place. I mean, the other things is also they're so important in stress regulation and neurotransmitter production. I call B12 my winter depression supplement, right? So oftentimes when people get winter, they get that low feeling, or I guess it's seasonal affective disorder. That's what I was looking for.
Yes.
B12 is often used as a way of overcoming it. So when the body's so depleted, B12 gets more depleted. So you need B12. That's such a critical, vitamin for production of all these things. And again, when one B vitamin's off, they all will be off. And that's one of the problems we deal with a lot.
I think that's a good way of putting it, because a lot of people just take B12. And if you just take B12, you can mask a folate deficiency, and vice versa. Also, like taking B vitamins as a complex is very synergistic, is what I'm trying to say. And the synergy between the vitamins is, when people think about nutritional supplements, taking one nutritional supplement alone generally isn't going to be the best. As a general rule, don't buy supplements on its own. Make sure that you're buying supplements in a group of other supplements that are high quality supplements, because otherwise you're going to mask other deficiencies. And they work better together. They're kind of like a team, kind of a team players. They work together, versus drugs work independently and have like a direct reaction on that particular, think of nutritional supplements completely different as drug medications, rather.
Someone asked about adrenals being on the floor. So again,
Yeah.
I thought that was really interesting. That we never want. So really, remember, we always go back to basics, and Nigma and I always talk about what foundation is. Remember, foundation from a medical standpoint is really getting your digestion and your blood sugar first. So if you can work on anything to begin with, those are the first two I would always pick, and start building up from there.
I agree. The other thing we talked about again was probiotics. I want to just backtrack to probiotics for 1 second, and its role in the digestive health and bacteria and depressive-like symptoms. There are some correlations. I know Keith talked about some research that you looked at, and how they're now looking at probiotics and researching changes in the brain. So changes in the gut affect changes in the brain, basically.
So they call it the second brain, but maybe it's the first brain.
I'm starting to think that as well, So we talked about that. And then somebody asked a question on vitamin D. And especially, is it advisable to constantly take basic vitamin D, especially for men, and especially in winter?
So let's forget winter. Let's talk about COVID-19. So there was a study just released that vitamin D deficiency increased mortality by 4 times from COVID-19, 4 times. And then we know normal vitamin D, the risk of even getting COVID-19 goes down by over 50%. That alone should be enough for vitamin D. But again, what's interesting is I think you need to take vitamin D all year round. So I think that even we see people, we measure lab values during the summer when the sun is out, vitamin D is still low. I think our absorption of vitamin D from the sun has really been hampered. We talked about this on a previous Instagram, talking about how maybe our exposure to fluorescent lighting on a constant basis is affecting the way our body absorbs vitamin D and processes it.
Absolutely. I think our body is using a protective mechanism to not absorb that. And, all year round is super important for vitamin D. I've tested patients in the summertime, and there's literally no difference in their vitamin D levels. And for men and women, and if you want to, I know Steve Marini asked the question, if you want to look at it this way, think of vitamin D as an anti-inflammatory, okay? Think about it as a huge jug of water putting out a fire. And, if we're having these constant fires in our body, these inflammatory responses, either coming from stress or hormone changes, the vitamin D is an integral part of that. It's actually a big part of my plan to many patients. And again, that's why I came up with a vitamin D supplement, because I wanted to put something out there that was safe and effective and giving results. Because it's like you and I, Keith, when we are constantly prescribing these supplements, we see a gap in the market because we want quality supplements. We want supplements that are going to actually work for our patients, for most of our patients. Obviously, we all have different unique needs. Like Keith, your needs are different than mine, but the common denominator between the two of us is the need for vitamin D.
And again, if you
look
at
darker skins.
Right, and if you look at studies on North America, I think is upwards of 85% are deficient. And again, remember, we're now learning that the lab values where they say 30 is really what you need is probably way too low, and it may be closer to 50 to 60. We're learning more and more. And I've talked about last time, vitamin D may also be a blood pressure medication. So we're learning more and more about that as well.
Again,
that helps with blood pressure regulation. Yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. A lot of my patients on vitamin D I really see a change in their hormone plan that I have them on. Even if you're taking bioidentical hormones, if your vitamin D levels are low, those bioidentical hormones are not going to work for you. So that's something you should check out.
And you've always told before, which is so important, that if you take high doses of vitamin D, you need vitamin K2 as well.
Yes.
Very important.
Very important. Okay. So let's talk about 5-HTP. I love 5-HTP. Let's talk about that.
So 5-HTP, and sometimes people also take things like tryptophan. 5-HTP, interesting enough, is your precursor to serotonin. We often use that to actually increase serotonin levels. And that's really critical because it's actually a direct precursor to serotonin. And it actually, unlike tryptophan, which doesn't go always directly to serotonin, has to take another step. So that's why I find 5-HTP. People often use it at night. Sleep. And also, what's always interesting about anxiety, you know what anxiety I find is always the worst? It's when you're by yourself, right? So when are the times we're by ourselves? It's in the evening before bedtime, in the morning when we first wake up. Those are really critical times where we need to kind of de-stress, right? We've had the stress of the day. Instead of reaching for that glass of wine, we can reach for our 5-HTP to relax our brain so that we sleep properly and refresh for the next day.
How about some turkey, Keith? You could reach for some turkey because turkey is rich in tryptophan. It's an amino acid that is found in turkey. And so that's why you feel super tired after having like turkey dinner at Thanksgiving or Christmas and everybody's passed out on the couch after, is because of that amino acid that sends us into a coma. It's like a food coma.
See, now I know why everyone's off the next day, right? So now the holiday goes into Friday for a reason, right? Because no one can get up Friday morning after all that tryptophan. That's one of the reasons. So
another one of my favorite foods is salmon, and it's super rich in omega-3s. There's a lot of research, Keith, around omega-3s and inflammation and elevating mood. Can we talk more about that?
So it's really interesting. So where it starts about is they've actually looked at it for dopamine support. So they've actually even used with something we call phosphatidylserine, which we talked about, which is a phospholipid, that it actually helps, and they've used it for things like attention deficit disorder, which is, we now learn, probably dopamine related, or things like narcolepsy, which is also where people cannot stay awake during the day, that it helps really support dopamine production. But also from an inflammation standpoint, it actually is really good in getting the brain to focus on doing what it's supposed to, right? As there's less inflammation going on, those neurotransmitters, we call those messengers, can get back and forth a lot easier for that aspect.
Right. And then everybody will be happy to hear. I know some of my friends who are so cute. They say, I eat some dark chocolate every night. Let's talk about dark chocolate. So those chocolate lovers out there, chocolate is healthy. It's got a healthy antioxidant. And the ancient Aztecs used to use cacao for actually libido. And it has a ton of antioxidants in there that actually can build the walls in our arteries and help support those arteries. So it boosts circulation. We've seen it lower blood pressure. But tell us a little bit more about what kind of dark chocolate to eat and how much.
That's a great question. And when, right? It becomes as well.
When? Yes.
So again, dark chocolate, I guess it's almost like a blood pressure medication, right? It relaxes the blood vessels.
Yeah.
And actually what it also does is reduce stress hormones. It does help regulate cortisol as well. So the question is, so the type is, you want to have the highest percentage as possible, right? So I think what we can actually eat without being too bitter, right? Because the higher the percentage of the
it's so bitter.
Cacao, the bitter, is probably somewhere between 70 and 85%. So I think whereas most likely, I think most people tolerate 70%. So what's interesting about it, again, because it can affect your blood sugar, that's something you want to have during the day, not before bedtime. So that's where I find we're
right.
You know what's interesting, if you always think about, and I was just thinking about that as you were talking, the other time where people feel kind of the mood is also when they have coffee breaks, right? Around 10 or 11 in the morning, around 3, we have a little bit of fatigue and stuff. That's where dark chocolate may have, a good role and help us actually be both a mood stabilizer, right? For helping with anxiety, but also help with fatigue around that time.
All right. That is a good one for chocolate lovers. That is your dream come true. Okay. Next is asparagus. Asparagus was supposed to be, we've seen it. The Chinese government proclaimed asparagus as a natural functional food. So it sort of helps with stress. And let's go a little bit about, why is it the folate inside the asparagus that's
So
helping?
asparagus is a great source of folic acid, of folate.
Yeah.
Remember one of the things about, there was such great, in the 70s, they really recognized there was such great folic acid deficiency. If you actually looked at grain products, right, that's when grain products started being enriched with folic acid and other B vitamins, because we found that people really were very deficient. And it's probably as our stress goes up, which today, I think this week probably gets higher and higher. Yes. As I talk to my patients, myself, I saw my bill for the shopping today, all those things. So my demand for folic acid is much higher. I'm going to go down and make some asparagus. So after we're done.
Let's all make asparagus for dinner tonight.
But also with it, I'm sorry to interrupt, but also it's actually a prebiotic. It helps our good bacteria also function. So it has another great role as well. So it's a great healthy prebiotic. It doesn't affect our blood sugars very much. It's a great food. It's one of my favorite vegetables, I would say, by far.
Me too. I do love asparagus. And some people have a funny smell when they pee it out. And so it's the way we metabolize asparagus is different in different populations as well.
But it's interesting. You know what it's B vitamins, right? If anyone's taking B vitamins, they get that same kind of reaction, actually, interesting enough.
Exactly.
When they urinate.
All right. The things we talk about on this wellness. You're lucky we're not talking about poop today, guys. We'll be doing that again soon if you want. So speaking of probiotics, what about sauerkraut?
So our naturally fermented foods, and remember, that's a very key point. You want naturally fermented. So oftentimes sauerkraut we buy in the store is sugar fermented. The way they speed up fermentation is they actually use sugar. So you want naturally fermented from a Whole Foods market, or I love those markets they have in the middle of town, where people make their own. It's so important because, again, feeding those probiotics. Remember, probiotics, probably with vitamin D, magnesium, those are the big three these days, and maybe vitamin C, of things that our body really needs to function properly. So prebiotics is almost like the food. So we're feeding those good bacteria to help grow and help our digestion be much better. Really critical.
And then broccoli. We all know that broccoli is good for us. It's rich in my favorite mineral, magnesium.
And also we get DIM from there, right? Which helps regulate estrogen and prevent breast cancer and prostate cancer as well. So broccoli has a lot of great things.
Let's talk about DIM for a second for people that are listening. So I know there's a lot of people on here asking questions about bioidentical hormone therapy. We'll get to your questions in a minute. Tell us more about DIM, Keith. And I use DIM and milk thistle with a lot of my patients who are taking hormone replacement therapy. It's super important because it metabolizes those bad hormones. Let's talk about that for a second, because that plays a huge role in anxiety.
Sure. So DIM is we call it, if you ever look at buy a bottle of DIM, you see it says it helps with estrogen metabolism. What it really is, it's what we call a natural aromatase inhibitor. So aromatase is the marker that actually helps change testosterone and estrogen between each other. And again, in cancer, what it does is also prevents what we call those bad estrogen metabolites from happening, the things you don't want. We use it often in men, especially when they get testosterone, to prevent that testosterone becoming estrogen. And actually, it's also used in women for the kind of the opposite reason, to prevent too much of that estrogen from becoming testosterone, from the opposite end. So it actually is really good at what we call hormone regulation. And that's what we use it mostly for.
Absolutely. And then avocado, which is super important. And I know,
that's my favorite avocado.
Food. Yes, I love avocados, and super good form of fat. And so quite often when people are taking their vitamin D supplementation, I personally take my vitamin D when I have avocado. I try to have a little bit of avocado every day. And it's super important. It's a good fat, and it is a strong antioxidant. And it's also rich in B6 and potassium and folate. So really, really good for the brain, really good fat. Your brain is made up of mainly fat, right? So if I called you fat head, that's actually...
Thank you.
So,
I appreciate the compliment.
I have a fat head.
So what's interesting also, it's probably the best form of fiber we have out there. So one of the great things about avocado, and fiber, remember, is so critical, is when fiber
Oh,
is linked with fat, fiber actually acts so much more effective. So I know a lot of people that use avocado to also regulate the bowels without getting bloated, that they're able to have normal. You said we would avoid poop, but we can't.
we
To have
can't get
normal
away
bowel
from it.
movement. So avocado is a great food for that. And actually, I use it more than anything else. It's the best way for me to regulate my blood sugar during the day.
Absolutely. And take your vitamin D with it. All right. Oats. Your mom always told you to have your oatmeal in the morning, and now there is a reason why, because it has a lot of minerals in it. It has a lot of magnesium in it. What else is it good for in terms of, I know with blood sugar
B
regulation?
vitamins, also we know about B vitamins now as well
Yes.
too. And also what it is foods like that that actually help absorb fiber. Remember, you want to have some fat. I love doing things like oatmeal with almond butter, for example, or with some other things, so that you actually have a very balanced and a very filling meal, but it actually helps also stabilize blood sugar when it's used that way. Very
And
important, because one of the genesis of anxiety is actually low blood sugar, right? When we feel low blood sugar, that can create anxiety a lot of times for people.
that's such a good question. And then we could do a whole like IG live just on blood sugar and anxiety, because that is one of the hugest. Whenever I speak to my patients about, okay, well, when did you feel anxiety? How long ago did you eat? And they often say, I didn't eat. And,
Right.
that is also fueling the anxiety. And then it's like a vicious circle. So mind your blood sugar levels. Make sure you don't forget to eat. I like this one, watermelon. I love watermelon. And I mean, maybe it's not perfect for now, but so good loaded with B6. So good for PMS symptoms and good
Right.
for regulation of mood. So come the summertime, get your watermelons out.
But you want to be careful again, because it can raise blood sugar. So be careful with that
Fair
aspect.
enough. Exactly. And then apples, an apple a day does keep the doctor away. Apples are super amazing. And I highly recommend you eat them, not juice them, because there's a big difference.
And actually, they help COVID too, right? Because again, that's our quercetin. Remember, quercetin is that we call citrus bioflavonoid that actually helps keep viruses from us. Really important to keep
And
that virus away. I love that.
yeah,
Apple a day keeps that virus away.
exactly. That's our new slogan. And so the apple also has fiber, rich in fiber, the peel. So keep the peel on the apple. Just wash it really nicely. I use a nice food grade hydrogen peroxide to clean all my fruit and veg. And it's really good to eat that peel, because that peel provides the fiber in the inside of the apple. I mean, Mother Nature is so amazing, isn't it, Keith? In the sense that if you look at an
Absolutely.
apple, the inside of the apple is really sweet. It's like, sugary. It's sugar. But what Mother Nature did was combined the peel of the apple so that the fiber can balance out the blood sugar. I mean, I just think it's incredible what Mother Nature has offered us.
Maybe one day we'll understand her.
Maybe one day we will. Maybe. Eggs. Eggs are a really good source of protein, and we know protein is super important for keeping the brain alert. And tell us more about eggs, Keith.
So also from a B vitamin, it's one of our best sources of B vitamins. Remember what's the job of an egg? It's actually keeping an organism alive, so that yellow part, or the yolk of the egg, has all those rich minerals and vitamins that our
Nutrients.
body needs. Probably of almost any food, it's probably one of the most complete from that aspect.
Okay, and then we have honey. I love honey.
Yeah. So honey helps you with blood sugar, and I like what I call Manuka honey, which is actually has a lot of health properties too. But again, remember, honey is also sugar based, so you
It
have to be
is.
careful
It is.
with usage. But it actually does help with some amino acids, which again, remember, amino acids we didn't talk much about today, but that's also another building block of our body, right? To help our body make hormones and function properly. We need fats, but we also need amino acids to build all these structures, so that our body's this great house, great mansion that works really well together with great plumbing and all the other things.
Awesome. I mean, I've made my turmeric latte and I put some honey in there, and I just put a little bit, and Manuka honey, which is also antiviral, antimicrobial. And then green tea. Green tea is like rich in theanine. So I personally can't have green tea. It makes me too jittery, even with the theanine connection, but there are some people that focus really well on green tea, and there's a ton of research as green tea being a really strong antioxidant with the epigallocatechin galates. I think that's how.
And remember, because again, green tea does have caffeine, so people that are very caffeine intolerant is problematic. But theanine, I love. It's an amino acid. I use it all the time. And the reason I like it a lot, I like it for sleep. And the reason I like it, it doesn't make you overtired. So it doesn't make you drowsy the next day. It helps really regulate cortisol really well. So your body's relaxed enough that it can go to sleep naturally, but not be over sedated when you wake up in the morning.
All right. So we have a question here. When is the best time to take probiotics? So, there really isn't, it depends on the type of probiotic you're taking, in the sense that, is it a strain that has, like the DDS1 strain, for example, with the Healthy Flora probiotics, you can take anytime, because what it does is it helps you bypass, because when you take a pill, you have to remember that your stomach acid is about 1.2 to 2 in pH, which is super acidic. So anything that you take orally is going to break down in your stomach. Your stomach is a very serious conditions in the stomach that break down stuff. It like churns. It can denature protein. It can do a lot of things because of the stomach acid. So take a probiotic that's been researched to survive the acidity of the gut lining of the stomach acid, and also the bile acids. So it doesn't really matter when you take it, but if you're just taking any probiotic, I recommend taking it on an empty stomach so that you don't have the breakdown as easily.
So I have people do it, like some people have trouble doing it first thing in the morning because of their schedule. So an option for them is at bedtime. So that's something you can actually do at bedtime away from food. And a lot of people do that very successfully.
Kitty Catch, I'm with you. Green tea does make my stomach turn as well. It's not for everyone. And it can make you feel shaky.
And so guarana also has caffeine. So remember, green tea and guarana also are caffeine based. So that's where that is.
Is there a magnesium that you can recommend? I really like magnesium glycinate. It doesn't sort of go right through you, and it really helps to take at night. Keith, do you have a favorite magnesium? I know there's so many different forms.
I actually use it based on what you need it for. So for heart health, I'll use magnesium orotate or glycinate. For brain health, I'll use threonate, which really crosses the blood-brain barrier. If you're using it for bowel regulation, you may use a form like oxide or citrate.
Yeah,
so it really depends what you use it for.
It'll go right. Yeah, there's so many different kinds of magnesium, guys. So make sure you pick the one that's good for you.
And actually, I use, oftentimes people who don't tolerate magnesium, I'll use a topical oil or spray as well. And that also can be used as well.
I put magnesium salts in my bath. I find that so helpful at night. I really have a good night's sleep when I do that. It's so nice because your skin is your
especially after my HIIT workout. Especially after my HIIT workout, I need tons of magnesium salts because I've learned as we age, the body does not recover as quickly.
No, it does not. Keith, did we miss anything from today? Does anybody have any other questions? You're welcome.
Thank you.
All right. Well, it was amazing to have all of you here with us today on our Wellness Wednesday. I will be saving this, so we will see you next week. Big kiss.